Hello, students. Now we're going to talk about capitalism versus communism. Francis Fukuyama, who was a U.S. State Department policy planner, said that democracy and capitalism and the free market system are so clearly triumphant over communism and other forms of socialism that no new forms of civilization are likely to emerge, and therefore we are now at the end of history. So Francis Fukuyama saying capitalism is just the best that there's ever going to be, and there's nothing else that can ever occur that will be better. Anytime you have anyone trying to persuade you of something like that or teach you something like that, the red flags should go up, because it's an either-or logic fallacy, a logic flaw, an all or nothing type logic flaw, and it's a refusal to embrace paradox, the possibility that two things on opposite sides of the belief spectrum might be true at the same time. But in any event, as soon as Francis Fukuyama made this assertion that capitalism had so totally and thoroughly won over the failed communist regime of the Soviet Union, history's great example of communism, which had failed so miserably. As soon as he said that means we're at the end of history, of course he was attacked and criticized by others, and among them was Henry Mintzberg, one professor who said, you know, what really happened was not the triumph of capitalism over communism. What really happened was we found a balance between strong private sectors, strong public sectors, that is government, and great strength in the sectors in between. At the same time that Francis Fukuyama was saying that capitalism is the ultimate win-all and be-all of an economic and democratic form of government, we had the World Alliance of Reformed Churches that represent 75 million Christians in 100 countries across the world, saying that capitalism as currently practiced can be blamed for job loss, grinding poverty, an unprecedented rise in crime and violence, ecological degradation, the spread of HIV and AIDS, and as currently practiced, capitalism should be banned because it's unfaithful to God. Wow. There's a rather powerful opinion. But you have to admit that in our current world situation, there's a great deal of what is called economic inequality. The richest 1% of people in the world have more wealth and more property than the poorest 57% of the people in the world. The richest 1% have more than the lower 57% of all the people in the world. And every day, 24,000 people will die somewhere in the world of poverty and malnutrition. So basically that means that during the 1 hour or so that you spend studying this class, 1,000 people will die of hunger, of starvation. Is that acceptable to you? Should you spend your every waking hour feeling sad and guilty about it? Do you know those 1,000 people that will starve to death this hour? Is there anything that you can do about it? Should you be doing something about it? 1,000 people will die of starvation and poverty during the hour that you watch this material, and every hour throughout our semester. One economics professor, talking about racial economic inequality recently, just within the last week, suggested that the United States should pay out $12 trillion to all African Americans as reparation, to compensate them for the fact that they were brought here in slavery, and to to eliminate the wealth gap between whites and blacks. $12 trillion. I don't know where he thinks that $12 trillion is going to come from. But then let me ask you a couple of questions about that. If we were to pay out $12 trillion in reparations to African Americans, Would someone like Kamala Harris get a piece of that $12 trillion? I don't think that either one of her parents were slaves. Well, I believe one was Jamaican and one was from India. So she's a black American. Is she going to get part of that reparation money? And another thing is, if we're paying for the fact that white people once had African American slaves, will every student that's currently in this class who has ever owned a slave please stand up now? Oh, I didn't think so. All right. Well, now here's another thing, though, perhaps more importantly, with regard to this economist's suggestion that paying out $12 trillion to poor black people will eliminate the wealth gap. If you want to know whether or not that would really eliminate the wealth gap, whether or not having the United States government pay huge amounts of money to an impoverished racial minority, whether that eliminates the wealth gap, do a little reading about what happened when the United States government paid millions of dollars to a small tribe of Native Americans in order to purchase their uranium-rich tribal lands. Just do a little reading about whether or not, in fact, that ended up being of any long-term benefit to those poor Native Americans when they got those huge sums of money without accompanying education or guidance. Now, on the other hand, the Wall Street Journal says that in a capitalistic society, rationality wins out, progress happens, and problems have solutions. This is what happens when a society incorporates the editorial credo of the Wall Street Journal: free markets and free people. And then you can counter that with articles by other magazines, editorials that say the free market system and complete freedom of things like editorial choice has caused our entertainment system to deteriorate to the lowest common denominator, and therefore worldwide, when we could have television programs and movies about symphonies and operas and science and intellect, instead we have Baywatch as the #1 American TV program outside the United States, and Baywatch being watched on the illegal TV channels in Arabic countries where it is offensive to their most basic religious beliefs, but they're all watching it secretly on the illegal TV channel anyway. Baywatch, a cultural representative of the culture of America. Baywatch. Well, it may be that our entertainment has deteriorated to the lowest common denominator, but that is perhaps one of the prices we have to pay to live in a free society where we truly have freedom of speech and freedom of the press. Now, a definition of a term, laissez-faire. Laissez-faire is a noun, and it's a policy of non-interference, especially by governments, from interfering in the workings of the free market. It comes from the French word allow to do. So the great controversy between capitalism and communism, or socialism or collectivism, as they are sometimes called, is an ongoing dispute between the idea of a laissez-faire government, hands-off the free market system, versus altruism. Now, altruism is a noun, and it means unselfish concern for others. Its origin is from the Latin word altrui, which means somebody else, or the Latin term altere, hui, to this other. And so the question is whether or not the government should keep its hands off of our free market system and our personal and private lives and allow us to figure out how we want to run our lives and our businesses, because we do it better than government. Or should the government be out there forcing us to be more charitable, to take care of the downtrodden and the poor and the socially excluded? Should government be forcing us to be more altruistic? Well, you got to stop for a minute and ask yourself a question. Altruism has to do with charitable intentions, and if it is the government forcing you to engage in allegedly charitable actions, then are they charitable anymore? Are they truly altruistic, or are they something else? The problem with government engaging in altruistic activities is that usually what it is it's a worthy cause which gives some corrupt politician an excuse for engaging in tyrannical seizure of control of power and abuse of power. That's how it always starts out. It always starts out with a worthy cause, and it almost always ends up being some form of dictatorship in the name of a good and worthy cause. Now, if you want to know how your parents from the 60s and who went to college in the 60s and the 70s, if you want to know how they got to thinking the way that many of them think, there were a number of books that almost every college kid read in the 60s, and one was The Lord of the Rings, and one was A Catcher in the Rye, which was one of the first sexy, dirty books. But there were also the books by Ayn Rand, The Fountainhead, and Atlas Shrugged. And you really want to know how your parents got to think the way they think. About half of the population that age read the Ayn Rand books and were totally taken with them, as I was, and became conservatives, and the others rejected the Ayn Rand ideas and became liberals. But the Ayn Rand books, Ayn Rand was a woman who came out of communist Russia and was convinced that communism was bad and that the only really democratic society was one that had a free market system with the government hands off, that selfishness and greed were good, they were a good motivation, they created man's highest performance and greater good. And so Ayn Rand said altruistic collectivist ethics are incompatible with freedom, capitalism, and individual rights. Individual rights are the means of subordinating society to moral law. Property rights and the right of free trade are man's only economic rights. They are in fact political rights, these economic rights, and there can be no such thing as an economic Bill of Rights. A Bill of Rights such as the one the Democrats wrote that said every person has the right to a good job and to a reasonable income. She said that it's an either-or situation. You can only have political rights or economic rights, as one destroys the other. Therefore, only those who advocate laissez-faire capitalism are true advocates of man's rights. And she would say that the role of government should be limited to police, a court system, and military defense of the country, and the government should keep its hands off of every other form of regulation of business or of our private lives. And there were many people that were greatly taken with this philosophy. I admit I was one too, and in the roots of my I still am somewhat of a conservative politically. The works of Ayn Rand had a great influence on me. But as you get older, you look and you say, well, Ayn Rand, with her all or nothing view of laissez-faire system of government, she didn't have it all right either. And if you really want the full tour de force of Ayn Rand, then I recommend you read The Fountainhead, and then you read Atlas Shrugged, but then you go and rent an old video movie called The Passion of Ayn Rand, which tells the story of her personal life and love life, and how her philosophy that selfishness is good worked out for her in real life. And I think you'll see that even Ayn Rand, did not have it all right about capitalism, about communism, and especially about the value of selfishness in one's personal life and love life.